over?
Absolutely. Thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to come in and give you all an update on exchange visitor program activities. Clark had asked me to give an update, very specifically to the consortium members for the HVACPC folks that he's the responsible officer for, especially since the pandemic in 2020. A lot of our programs were shut down and really inactive for a good amount of time. And even in the case of a large research institution like mine, we're just now starting to get back to pre-pandemic level requests with our J-1 exchange visitor program. And the pandemic itself and some things that have happened since the pandemic have led to several updates over the last couple of years from the Department of State that Clark wanted me to go over, make sure everybody is aware of how to handle it. He also had some things within the consortium members that he wanted to address, like employment of both students and scholars. And so we're going to be covering all of those activities here. So first, when it comes to program administration updates, there's been, again, over the last 3 years or so, a number of important updates for how responsible officers are supposed to be handling things. There's incident reporting requirements you need to make sure you're aware of. There's special populations because of turmoil going on throughout the world with Ukraine, Palestine, Israel that you need to be aware of. They are desperately trying to clean up bad data in the J-1 system for program sponsors. And so they are doing audits that responsible officers might get inquiries about or requests to clean up. We'll talk about that. They've put out some clarification regarding notations that get put on the DS 2019 for when somebody is subject to the 2-year home residency requirement. The Department of State has finally caught up with SEVP for RF students in allowing digital signatures on the DS 2019 forms. We'll talk about that. They've also stressed what are the requirements for allowing for work, remote work and online classes, as well as reporting changes of site activity. So in the last 3 years or so, all of those things, have popped up from the Department of State for program administration of a J-1 program, and we'll cover those. A couple of other things that Clark wanted me to address are on-campus employment for students, work options for scholars, travel requirements, and managing when and how long people are gone in SEVIS, for the research scholars in particular, and also briefly talk about extending and shortening programs. So we're going to talk about all of those things during this first hour. But let's start with the first on the list, which is serious incident reporting. So anytime a J-1 exchange visitor is having any kind of difficulty fulfilling the terms of their J-1 exchange visitor program, or they're involved in some type of controversy, your school might be involved in some type of controversy, the incident must be reported to the Department of State. And the key thing is it's supposed to be reported within 1 business day. So they don't mess around with serious incident reporting. Something happens to one of your exchange visitors, or something comes up with your program in the news, they want to know about it, and they want to know about it now. Now, there are a number of examples of incidents that can qualify. Illness of an exchange visitor. Now, they don't mean if somebody has to miss a day because they're sick, but what they want to know is if one of your exchange visitors gets any type of an illness that requires them to take any kind of a medical leave from their J-1 program. They want to know about that. So that can be as simple as getting surgery, then they're going to be out for a few weeks, or it can be more serious injuries, a diagnosis of a serious illness that's going to require treatment. Hopefully you never have to deal with the death of an exchange visitor, but certainly that's going to qualify. They also want to know if your exchange visitor has been the victim of any crimes or harassment. So if they have, they're supposed to report that to you. You're supposed to report it to the Department of State. If there's any kind of incident with your program that brings notoriety or disrepute to the program, that's supposed to be reported. And if your EV is from one of the affected areas around the world, whether it's Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, someplace else, Syria, whatever it is, if their ability to engage in their programs or return home at the conclusion of the program is going to be affected, all of those things require reporting with the Department of State. Now, for those of you who are part of, the consortium here, where Clark is the responsible officer, you should report the incident to Clark. And Clark, as the responsible officer, should report it when time allows. Again, keep in mind, you've got to report this within 1 day. If for some reason Clark's not around and can't meet that reporting requirement within that 1 day window, an alternate responsible officer can absolutely do the reporting as well. But, you got to make sure Clark's aware of it. He'll take care of the main reporting, except when he can't get to it within that 1 day window. And then you need to report it as the ARO. Now, you need to report it on a specific form. So they have an academic and government programs incident report form that you have to fill out and email to the Department of State. You got to tell them who it is, what's their CVIS number, what happened, what actions have been taken so far, what are the next steps that are going to be involved, in the process, if they're getting medical treatment, whatever it is, and then updates when each of those things happen, and hopefully the incident gets wrapped up and goes away. So, all of those things are important to keep in mind with incident reporting, and whenever in doubt, report the incident. Sometimes it's not clear whether or not something is really reportable. When in doubt, Department of State says report it, and we'll tell you if it's important or not. Now, what I will say is I'm going to go through all of the list of items we're going to talk about. So if you have questions on something, write it down, make a mental note of it, and when I'm done with everything, I'll open it up for questions on any of the topics that we cover. Now, next thing is, recently, obviously, everybody's aware of what's going on in Israel and West Bank and all that stuff. And so I doubt that any of you might have EVs from those areas, but potentially you could. We have a couple. But if you have EVs from Israel or the Palestinian territories, what the Department of State now says is available is, first, if they're having problems engaging in their programs because of what's going on, their funding or whatever, you've got to report that as an incident. But you're allowed to obviously extend their program for the maximum duration that they're allowed. 5 years for a research scholar, for example. But during whatever you say you want to keep them for, they have to be engaged in real J-1 program activities. And so you would have to be open to and have the ability to extend the purpose of their program. Now, what if somebody's reaching the maximum period? Well, they're now going to entertain requests for extensions of up to 12 months beyond the maximum category duration, but each one's on a case-by-case basis. You have to go to the system, PayGov, and pay their $367 extension beyond the maximum period fee that they charge, and submit the documentation of what the issue is and why they can't go home. And then they will evaluate it and likely approve it. The same is true for somebody who wants to change their category because of all this. Maybe you've got a research scholar here currently who doesn't want to go home and maybe decides, getting a PhD would be a good idea. I want to change to the J-1 student category. They will entertain changes of category for visitors from Israel or Palestine again, paying the $367 fee in pay.gov to make that request. Now, you should also make sure that all of your EVs, not just those that have serious situations like this, are aware of the Department of State's J-1 emergency helpline number. It's a resource that's available to anyone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and EVs are supposed to have that phone number and know that if they have real issues with their program for whatever reason, they're able to report it to the Department of State. Now, Ukraine is still obviously at war with Russia, and there's some things that are in effect for them as well. Special student relief, and for those of you who don't deal with F1 students much, special student relief is a classification of work authorization that allows students to study part-time and work full-time. It's a process that F1 students have to go through with Department of Homeland Security to apply for and get that designation. The Department of State has decided to mirror that and allow for special student relief for J-1 exchange visitors as well from the Ukraine. They have to have been in the U.S. since August 16th, 2023. And just like it works for the Fs, it allows them to work full-time on or off campus and carry a lighter course load, half the time of enrollment. But since work authorizations for J-1s do not go to Homeland Security, they are authorized by the AROs and AROs. There's a specific process Department of State wants you to follow for those individuals. And so you're going to open up their SEVIS record, and in the remarks field, you're going to put special student relief work authorization granted until April 19th, 2025. That's how long it's available. If their program's going to expire before then, you make it a little bit earlier. And you also go into the comments field of their SEVIS record, and you put reduced course load authorized. And so J-1 students, if you have any from Ukraine, are eligible to take care of or take advantage of special student relief measures. And so keep that in mind if you have any of those. Now, one of the things the Department of State is really, really focusing on is making sure programs are keeping all the required data in the system up to date. What they've realized in reviewing and doing audits of program records is not all of them are up to date. And so they're doing audits of specific programs and who's missing data and who's not. And if any of the data is missing, they're going to contact the program sponsors and say, hey, get this updated. All of this information is data that should be updated upon their initial arrival into the U.S., your validation of their J-1 record, and then they're supposed to keep you updated with this information, and you update SEVIS accordingly. But let's talk about a couple of the things that they're really, looking at. So, physical address. They want to make sure that there is a physical address in the U.S. for the individual. And if there's any bad data, missing zip codes or whatever it is, the address line doesn't look right. You've got the apartment number before the street address. They're looking at all of those, kinds of things. And if it's not correct, they're asking you to get it corrected and updated. If for some reason there's missing or incomplete site activity information, they're going to contact you about that. If for some reason the I-901 fee payment is missing, they're going to contact you about that. If they're missing a U.S. phone number, they're going to contact you about that. If they're missing an email address, they're going to contact you about that. And they're also paying attention to EVs within the same program who might be sharing things like email addresses and phone numbers. Sometimes exchange visitors, don't have an email address, and you put the generic international office email, for example. They're looking at all of those things, to make sure that everybody's information is up to date and is unique. If for some reason the subject field information isn't correct, they're going to contact program sponsors to get that updated. And if any part of your business address is not complete, they're going to update that. Now, hopefully, none of this information is ever missing on your exchange visitors. Again, all of that is required to create the DS 2019, to validate a program, but they found that there are lots of information that is missing or that may not be specific to the exchange visitor that's in play. And so they could be reaching out to you to update data if necessary. But if you're doing your responsibilities correctly up front and while you're authorizing things, everything should be good. Now, they recently put out guidance regarding remote work and online classes. And effective July 1 of last year, they mandated that any COVID-related relief that schools were allowing be sunset, and that everybody's back to being in-person programs. However, they realize now in the current environment that in-person for a lot of people means the ability to do some remote activities. But they're very clear on the fact that J-1 exchange visitors is supposed to be an in-person program. And regardless of what your school allows for certain employees, if you want somebody to come to be an exchange visitor, only 40% of their duties can be done remotely, meaning they can remote work if your school allows it for 2 of the 5 work days. They have to be in person the other 60% or 3 days. And so you got to keep that in mind. It also applies to college and university students participating in academic training. The academic training is supposed to be in person, not remote work. And so you got to make it clear to your students engaging in that you better be in person at least 3 days a week. And they stressed that college and university students may engage in a maximum of 1 online course per semester to reach their full-time enrollment threshold. But if a course has both in-person and virtual components, that they're going to allow that, again, provided that the student's not using more than 3 credit hours to reach full-time enrollment, and that the class does have an in-person component to it. If it does, it's not considered an online course. And so keep that in mind when it comes to remote work and online classes. Now, just very recently, a few days ago, they put out clarification regarding SEVIS and the DS 2019s being notated automatically for the exchange visitor being subject to Rule 212E or the 2-year home residency requirement. And so when a DS 2019 form is created in SEVIS, it is automatically checked as being subject to 212E, first and foremost if they're doing alien physician training, which probably none of you are dealing with. But if the exchange visitors program is being financed by a U.S. government agency, the exchange visitors government, or if your current program sponsor is a government agency, which is none of you. But if any of those things are true, the DS 2019 is automatically checked as being subject to the 2-year home residency requirement. And for what purpose? The Department of State never checks exchange visitor skills list. It's only based on the funding sources. And so only the embassy or the Department of State would be checking that somebody is subject based on the exchange visitor skills list. They don't do that when creating it in SEVIS. But you'll see the automatic check marks come up when the funding is appropriate for that. Now, what they said in this is, again, they reiterated, we populate it for certain things. The department or the consular officer will populate it for others. But they also made it clear that they're checking that box saying somebody is subject is not the definitive determination of whether or not somebody actually is subject to the 2-year rule. That is based on the visa stamp and how it is notated. And so every J-1 exchange visitor should have an annotation on their visa stamp that the bearer is or is not subject to Rule 212E. So that's the 2-year requirement, and it says it either applies or it doesn't. That's what takes precedence in determining whether or not somebody is subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, not necessarily what's being checked on the DS 2019 form. And so that clarification is pretty important for us as responsible officers to know, because it's not uncommon to have the DS 2019 check that they're subject, but the visa stamp says they're not, or vice versa. The visa stamp says they are subject, but the DS 2019 doesn't say anything on it. So this is pretty clear guidance on when you need to be encouraging your exchange visitors, if they're interested in staying longer, changing their status, what they need to do. As long as the visa stamp says they're not subject, they're not subject, and they should be able to change their status, and they don't have to apply for a waiver or request a formal interpretation of whether or not they're subject to the rule. So that's an important clarification that they've put in writing for the first time that is important to understand. Now, the big news is, as of last April, the Department of State finally caught up with the rest of the SEVIS world in allowing for electronic signatures. Now, during the whole pandemic, while we were able to issue electronic I-20s for our F1 students, we weren't able to issue electronic I-20s for our J-1 exchange visitors. We still had to print them, sign them, and send them. But they have now finally caught up with the rest of the compliance world, and they are allowing us to issue DS 2019s with electronic signatures. But keep in mind, what they're allowing is different than what is allowed for the F1s. Part of it's the same, but part of it's different. And so what they're saying is they're going to allow us to utilize any digital signature software that is appropriate with the crypto, typology that's involved in all those things. They have identified 3 things in the interim final rule: DocuSign, Adobe Sign, and Global Sign. And so only digital signatures are permitted. Those who deal with F students know you can make a copy of your real signature and put that on the form, and some other things. That does not exist for the DS 2019s. You have to use one of the digital signature options. But the good news is we no longer have to print and mail DS 2019s. They can have electronic signatures, put on them. And so that is a very good thing. Now, Department of State has emphasized many times over the last couple of years that changes to site activities and authorizing things like occasional lectures and authorizing academic training, that we as ROs and AROs have to do a better job of determining when those things get input into SEVIS and when they don't. Obviously, somebody's going to do academic training that has to be put in. Occasional lectures for your research scholars, that has to be put in. But in a lot of cases, historically, a lot of ROs haven't been, when those things are authorized, gone in and added a new site location for those activities. So if somebody's going to go give an occasional lecture, you need to keep your location, obviously, as the primary location for the exchange visitor program, but you have to also, in addition to authorizing that lecture, go in and add to the site activity section that information, where they're doing it, what dates. The same is true for academic trainings. Some ROs and AROs were doing that, some were not. But in CVIS, you have the ability to add multiple site activities. And whenever you authorize somebody for an occasional lecture, academic training, you need to make sure that you're adding that site of activity to the CVIS system. They want it in there. And I can tell you, up front, I was one. Academic training we always did, but occasional lectures, historically, we never entered. And then about a year and a half ago, I got a contact from the Department of State and said, hey, we see that you've authorized an occasional lecture for this exchange visitor, but there's nothing in the site activity information that details that. Well, nobody's ever made that clear that updating the site activity for an occasional lecture was actually necessary, but that is what they want, and you need to make sure that that's what you're doing. And they put out some guidance on that fairly recently. Make sure that that's what you're doing anytime you authorize those types of activities. All right. So those are, all of the major announcements that came directly from the Department of State the last couple of years for program administration. Now, Clark wanted me to talk about several functions for the consortium members, and one big change when it comes to on-campus employment. So J-1 students have always been able to work on campus, and they're always eligible for academic training as well. But when HEPC first started this consortium, for whatever reason, it was determined that they weren't going to promote the fact that the J-1 exchange students could work on campus. But the fact is, by regulation, they are absolutely allowed to, just like any F1 student, 20 hours a week while school is in session, but you need to make sure that that's being monitored. That was probably some of the philosophy behind why it wasn't, put up as an option initially. I don't know if you want to jump in there, Clark, and give something other than that, but for whatever reason, in the J-1 program handbook for the consortium, HEPC said no on-campus work, but that is now changing. On-campus work is absolutely allowed for your degree and non-degree J-1 students, and just make sure they're not exceeding 20 hours a week, and make sure that you are somehow monitoring it. Now, unlike F1 students whose on-campus work does not have to be put on the I-20, on-campus work for every J-1 does have to be put on the CVIS record. And so you've got to go into CVIS and you've got to indicate that the student is working on the premises. If you have a degree-seeking student who's actually getting an assistantship, there's a separate designation for that as well. But you've got to go into the CVIS system and you've got to put the name, and as crazy as that sounds, yes, you're putting your name of the university on there, the address, the number of hours. You've got to put a begin date and an end date for each time that can't exceed 1 year. So that means you've got people here multiple years. If they're going to work multiple years, at the conclusion of that first authorization, you got to go back in and you've got to add a new authorization to include the new time period. And you select the employment type and you add the student employment. So, this is something that's going to be new to all you AROs out there with the consortium in terms of allowing students to work on campus and having to input that into the CVIS system when you allow it. So keep that in mind. Now,
I just
employment.
Ron, I just wanted to add that if any of our ARs want to add that, please let me know beforehand, just so that I'm, involved, and because monitoring was the main issue that we didn't do it before. So
Great. Okay. Now, when it comes to scholar employment, anytime you bring a scholar to campus for J-1 activities, that institution is allowed to pay the scholar for those activities if they want to do that. And scholars can be authorized for occasional outside lectures with the permission of the responsible officers. And so normally, coming in, when a scholar is going to be funded for the activities or not, you put that on the DS 2019. But sometimes they come in with their own funds or funds from a different source, and you decide, hey, we'd like them to teach this class and we're going to pay them. If those kinds of things happen during the program, you got to make sure you go in, update the finances, and make sure you've indicated that. The occasional lectures we talked about, you've got to make sure that in addition to writing the authorization for them to engage in it, you've got to go in and add that site of activity for the period of time in question for your scholars. So you got to keep all that employment in mind for your scholars. Now, travel requirements, and this is where a lot of J-1 program responsible officers do get confused. I mean, when somebody says travel, the first thing that comes to everybody's mind is, well, the visitor's got to get a travel signature on the DS 2019. That is absolutely true, but many exchange visitors, especially research scholars and professors, oftentimes have to take extended trips overseas, and having a policy in place for those visitors so you can determine when you have to do things like fill out the out of country functionality in SEVIS and how long somebody can be gone. That needs to be understood, and every program has to make its own rules when it comes to this. But there's some general things that you need to keep in mind. And Clark, these are recommendations that I would make for you guys as a consortium to follow. In some cases, they're going to be mandates, like the travel signature. That's a mandate, right? They travel, you've got to sign the travel signature section of the DS 2019, and a signature is good for 12 months. No other SEVIS authorization is necessary when a EV is traveling temporarily. But this is where there's great differences in the field on who does what. Just how long is somebody allowed to be gone for personal or for exchange visitor program activities? The general rule that everybody follows, that most people follow, is if you're going to be gone for personal or business reasons for trips of less than 30 days, you don't have to do anything else in SEVIS besides sign their DS 2019 form. But if they're going to be gone more than 30 days, that's when decisions have to be made. In general, most J-1 programs draw the line at someone being gone for more than 30 days for personal reasons. If you're going to be gone more than 30 days, then we have to talk about why this program needs to stay active, and what is your policy going to be. And a great number of programs draw the line at 30 days. An EV who's gone for more than 30 days can only stay active in the J-1's program, in the SEVIS program, if they're going to be engaged in program activities while they're abroad. So if somebody wanted to go away for 3 months for personal reasons, well, is that something you're going to allow as a program? Most programs won't. But if you're going to be gone for 3 months, and while you're gone, you're going to be engaged in research and the activities that are part of the J-1 program you were brought here for, that's fine. But then you've got to go into SEVIS, and you've got to populate the out-of-country functionality. All right, so you've got to keep all of that in mind. Now, if they're not going to be engaged in program activities and are going to be gone more than 30 days, what you need to do is shorten the program to when they're leaving, and that's the end of their that's the end of their program. And under no circumstance can anybody who's going to be gone, even if they're going to be gone to be involved in, lab activities and other parts of the J-1 program, if they're going to be gone more than 1 year consecutively, you should never be keeping the J-1 record active. That's just too long of a break, for the Department of State's liking. And so when you go into SEVIS to create an out-of-country record, you're going to tell the system when they're leaving, when they're coming back, where they're going, and what's going to be that out-of-country location. And then you put in some remarks. Why are they going? But what you should be enforcing here is that during this period, they are going to be engaged in the J-1 program activities, and that is why you are keeping the J-1 record active. And so then when they come back in, you make sure that they've presented you with the I-94 card and all those things, and you reset the record that they're back. So, all of those things are important when you're considering travel for your exchange visitors. I'm not sure what the consortium's experience is going to be with people being gone, but at my institution, for example, we have 300-400 exchange visitors, and it's not uncommon for them to want to be gone more than 30 days. And it's not uncommon for them to be going to labs in other countries to engage in part of the experiments and those things for substantial periods of time. And you've got to make sure that you've got a process involved to know that and make the appropriate signatures or reporting when that is in fact the case. All right, next I want to talk about extending a program. And so depending on what category they're here for, and most J-1 programs have authorization for research scholars and professors, which is 5 years, short-term scholars, which is 6 months, and students, which is however long it takes them to complete a degree, or if it's a non-degree, the maximum period is 2 years. But anytime somebody has time left in the program, they want to continue, and you have a program for them to continue in, then you're going to go into SEVIS and you're going to extend the program end date, and you can add some remarks on why it's being extended if you want, but it's not mandatory. If any of the finances change during that, you got to also make sure you go in and you update the finances to extend the program. Now, earlier, I talked about extending the program beyond the maximum limit for Israel and Palestinian territories. There is the ability to always ask for an extension beyond the maximum period and paying that $367 fee. However, you just need to know as a program administrator that unless the Department of State has told you ahead of time, we are going to make accommodations for people from Palestine and Israel, for example. Unless that kind of notice is out, they never approve extensions beyond the maximum period without some really extreme circumstances. They just don't. 5 years is the limit for research scholars and professors, and regardless, they're not going to extend it. So you got to keep all that stuff in mind. Now, shortening a program is very important as well. It can be done too. So if you're issuing something for a couple of years and it gets accomplished in 1 year, you've got to go in and update the SEVIS record. And what you should never do in those cases is terminate the SEVIS record. You need to shorten the program to the appropriate date and then select the reason that you are shortening it, whether it's program objectives have been completed early, the individuals decided to withdraw themselves, death of an exchange visitor. The Department of State only wants you using the terminate function in very extreme circumstances where somebody has truly violated their status. You know, those who do Fs know that terminate and Fs have a lot of different options, whether somebody's violated or not, with other legitimate reasons for non-violations using terminate. Never use terminate in CVIS for J1s unless somebody truly did do something, you know, like work without authorization, those kinds of things. Anytime somebody's program is ending early, whatever it is, you make sure you shorten it to the appropriate date, select the reason, and then the system gets updated. Anytime somebody's leaving, you know, early as well. So what is early? Department of State says early is more than 15 days before the scheduled end date. If they're leaving more than that, then we want you to shorten the program. So you gotta keep that in mind as well. So all of those things are going to be done. You know, you go to CVIS and you put in the new date, and they do require remarks for this one, unlike the extend button, and you shorten the record, and everything is up to date, and you're good. So that is all the updates that have come from the Department of State the last couple of years. Those are some of the key topics, you know, Clark wanted to address for the consortium members. At this point, be more than happy to open up your mics and ask any questions on any of the topics that we covered.